I fully woke up and believed the rumors about Sydney Sweeney and Elon Musk getting together because it was all over my feed. And it took only a couple clicks to realize that it's completely generated by Grok. But yeah, it's pretty bizarre that this feature just sort of rolled out without considering that there should probably be a couple safeguards in place. Well, so not to regurgitate like what we talked about last episode, but I think I've reached my tipping point and I think I'm officially ready to leave X, and it all has to do with our dear friend Grok.
I mean, Grok, as everyone knows, has been getting increasingly creepy. People have been using that image editing feature to undress women and children. Although Musk questions it's extended to children, but evidence suggests it's also been used on children. And it's, ordinary users whose profile pictures have their faces just suddenly waking up and realizing that they're spammed with comments where they've been put in bikinis or where they've been put in sexually suggestive postures, and in some cases, just outright violence against them. And it's been pretty disturbing for anyone to watch.
No, I don't have an X account which is very active. I've not liked the experience that I have on the platform since Musk took over. But I logged back in when all this was going on and I thought I wouldn't find anything. It can't be there the moment you log in from an inactive account. But I was wrong. It was just everywhere. I could see comments of people going, add Grok, undress her. Add Grok, could you put her in this particular position? And it was weird.
X said that it's rolled this back after receiving a lot of pushback. But what I was seeing is that people have found ways to get around it also. So, right now, if maybe you ask Grok to generate a nude image of somebody who's wearing clothes, they may not allow you to. But what people have decided to do is ask for the closest possible thing, which is the picture of someone in a clear bikini, because that gets them the approximation of what they want. So, perverts remain perverts, as we as we realize. There's also this other actually Rolling Stone article I was reading, which was really interesting. It was from the vantage point of a woman who was affected by this. And she said one of the things that really freaked her out is the fact that the image that was generated of her were freakishly accurate to her actual body, where she was like, the way my collarbone dips, I feel like if I look in the mirror, that's what I'm like. And so it's not just, I mean, you've always had very, I guess, cheap, edited, doctored kind of things, but I guess the realism of this is another factor that's really freaking people out.
My impulse is to just go away from X and turn to another platform. But where do you even go at this point? Because I thought Reddit would be an escape for it, and I do use Reddit often because some communities are very interesting. And to my surprise, there are communities featuring explicit images made using Grok, and it's just right there on the platform, and the problem kind of just follows you along.
I think it's almost a bigger issue with content moderation that we're seeing across a range of platforms, and obviously it gets sort of highlighted, and it Grok kind of put X in the spotlight with it. But yeah, I
Mhm.
think Reddit has the same issue as well, where it opens a larger conversation, I think, about the efficacy of centralized and decentralized moderation systems.
If you cast your memory back 3 years ago when Musk took over Twitter, a lot of people were very unhappy with it because they completely disagreed with his vision for the platform. The core problem that they really had with the Twitter, it's not really about X, it's like you said about centralized moderation, where there's one central platform that has control over moderation decisions. Yes, they may outsource moderation to another entity, but at the end of the day, that platform is in charge of moderating what goes on over its service. And people really disagreed with the way moderation was working. They didn't think it was effective enough. Maybe in some cases, they didn't align with the ideology of the platform as with X. And so they thought something like a Reddit, where they have some control over how something is moderated at the subreddit level, will be more empowering. I assume that there's also a flip side because a subreddit is a smaller universe, it has its own rules. But then, if something harmful is on a subreddit, how are you going to make sure that it is kind of properly taken down when it's a volunteer moderation sort of thing? And can it even travel across subreddits?
I think in about 2016, 17, we've seen this play out on Reddit. Around that time, non consensual sexual imagery became a huge issue on Reddit, with people essentially clicking pictures of women wearing skirts and essentially aiming the camera under the skirt and clicking non consensual images and posting it across Reddit. So Reddit was able to take down, subreddits it saw explicitly violating their terms of service. These images traveled across subreddits, in many instances labeled as consensual images on subreddits where sexually explicit content was allowed. Of platforms like 4chan. where the only guideline people have to follow is pretty much whatever you want to do should go into specific boards where that content is allowed or that theme is encouraged. Except that I think 4chan only filters out DMCA based content. And in a model like this, another concern is the moderators who even try to regulate these boards with their own sort of guidelines. They don't really have an incentive to do that. In platforms like Instagram, there is some sort of incentive to moderate because ads have to play out and no brand really wants to, be placed in a place where such content is also there. So what do you do?
Yeah, true. Because if you think about it on an Instagram, say, because there are advertisements on that platform, no large centralized platform would really want harmful content on it, because then who's going to advertise? And your viewers are typically also people who don't want to see it. But then when you go to a 4chan, and that's no longer a constraint, conversely, the lack of dependence on advertising can hamstring you in this way. And so clearly what we're seeing is that even your partially decentralized model, where it's like there is still a company, there is still some control you can have over subreddits, even at a more central level. But clearly, even that kind of hybrid model is failing. What that's led some people to actually do is go completely on the other side, right? And go to something like a Mastodon or a Blue Sky. So, like, just to catch everyone up, I think every people may have heard of Mastodon around 2022, 23. That's when it first entered mainstream media reporting for sure. It's been around since 2016. But what it really is it's really kind of a mini ecosystem of different instances built on an open protocol called ActivityPub. So what you can think of is, if you're, say, within, I don't know, a Facebook or even a Reddit for that matter, you're still within a proprietary entity's platform. Mastodon tried to envision itself a little differently as something more open, built on an open protocol, where each server, which is called an instance, could set its own rules on what is allowed, what is not allowed. There are some broad, very universal principles they must follow, like they should not allow sexism, they should not allow racism, but they're quite broad based. So there's a lot of freedom at each server level to set your own rules and guidelines. And the idea is that each server, it's like an island of its own. There is no interference between server A and server B. So as an example, Chavi could be on a server or an instance called mastodon.social. I could be on mastodon.earth. We're both on Mastodon, but because we're on different servers, we are subject to different guidelines. And the way moderation would work would be very different for both of us. And neither of those servers would be able to influence each other. So naturally, people thought the answer is more control, perhaps, right, rather than less. Even that hybrid model we talked about with Reddit, maybe they felt didn't go far enough. But I think, again, it's an open question on whether even a Mastodon kind of model has delivered on the promise of making people safer and preventing this spicy Grok kind of controversy.
I think it's almost because the way that you explained it, it sounds that moderation then becomes more legible to me as a user, where I actually know who the moderators are, what the rules are, and what happens if they're broken, which I think seems like something that's harder to do, when there is a bigger entity in play. But on the flip side, I think that's true for most of the internet, is that there will be bad faith actors out there. So it seems like there's still a little bit of like a risky space in entirely decentralized moderation.
I think something like a Mastodon, it would only work if everyone is super ethical and very proactively censoring themselves in order to align with at least the six broad principles that Mastodon has set. Because Mastodon, the other problem then becomes, because it's not controlled by a centralized entity, all these different instances can communicate with each other because they're working on the same protocol. So something like a Threads, for example, also works on the same protocol that a Mastodon works. And unlike how centralized social media, like something like an Instagram works, if I have a Mastodon account, I can still access content that users post on Threads because there's just instances on the same decentralized system. So this can be compared to sort of like an email. To look at an email someone sends me from an Outlook email address, I don't need to have an email account there. I can still receive that email on a Gmail server. So similarly, this works, but say Mastodon somehow had the capacity to regulate people on these instances, or people signing up for Mastodon were this specific demographic of people who were very ethical. Even then, on another platform, say something like a Threads, people could post something which is not aligned with their value systems, and they can still have access to it. So unless you sort of create small isolated groups between a decentralized system where you're able to regulate everything on an individual level, it's not like moderation in the traditional sense that we understand it will not work on these decentralized systems.
Yeah, and in fact, Stanford has already found a lot of instances of non-consensual intimate imagery, even on these. They're called federated social media, like usually, or the Fediverse. That's one term that some scholars use for it. But there's a Stanford report that came out around 2022, 23, might be mistaken a little on the year, but fairly recent, which clearly shows you that this doesn't work. And there's a bunch of other questions that come up. One is, like Chavi said, the capacity to moderate is not there, right? Because you're confined in what you can moderate. Each one is that cross posting you can't address. The second is, like we said, if I am on one instance, mastodon.earth, Chavi is on mastodon.social, the her moderator may be really proactive and she may not see, say, child sexual imagery. But if my moderator is not an active person, I'm not spared that indignity, right? And so it can keep traveling. The other thing is actually because you have these larger centralized platforms, what they've done over the years, they've obviously understood that their platforms can be leveraged for bad purposes. So they've put in place some measures like, say, keyword blocks, which work because you know a list of bad words that are used to, look for content on your platform, or a list of known URLs which are bad, for example. That works when you have like a centralized repository. But when you are decentralized in your architecture, it's really hard for you to preserve online safety using the same mechanism. And that's something a lot of researchers have uncovered, which is that it's really easy to circulate bad content because these kind of blocks don't tend to work in practice. The other open question is also, look, there's been a lot of literature critiquing how moderation works on larger platforms because, yes, it is contracted out and you don't really know how moderators are engaged, what is the condition. But at the end of the day, when something goes wrong, there is an incentive to moderate. Now, here, if moderation is largely voluntary, and like Chavi said, you have to be a good ethical person, that really seems to be the assumption we're living in. But what happens when that kind of just isn't enough of an incentive? If an instance has many users, and this is something I'm doing in my free time, I'm not getting money. And even if I'm a very good-hearted person, I am just, strapped for time. There are other things to do. So when something like in non-consensual intimate imagery is on the line, which is like an utter invasion of privacy and dignity, how do you make sure you have the capacity to moderate that and you have the incentive to do that at scale? The other problem that tends to come up, and this is something I think maybe Chavi briefly mentioned, I don't know if we've talked about it yet properly, but defederation. One solution that people have come up to is, let's say Chavi's instance on mastodon.social has a lot of problematic content. We know for a fact that it's happening. My instance, mastodon.earth, can defederate. So it can basically make sure no content from her server ever reaches mine. And that's something to prevent these individual kind of measures that you would otherwise have to take. But you can't do that very well at scale. And so whether you can ever really ensure that unproblematic content goes removed or unchecked is really hard. And again, if I think of measures like content takedowns that we see on larger platforms or even account suspensions, how do you do that when it's not a centralized platform? Maybe I just get removed from one instance. I can go somewhere else and I can start on mastodon.social or mastodon. Whatever, any other instance. And I can start my problematic behavior all over again. So it'll be like a whack-a-mole solution to everything, right?
Defederating model, I also think just is counterproductive because the whole reason something like a Mastodon is really popular is because it appeals to this specific demographic of people who want access to broader services and they want integration. So if I'm just created those silos, it defeats the whole purpose of the ecosystem. And what makes it worse is other platforms, these centralized models of social media or the platforms we traditionally consider as social media, they do have like laws and governance models which directly apply to them. And these models, from what I understand, cannot translate into a regulation that would also apply to these things.
Yeah, I think, Chavi, that's a great point, actually. So this argument has been made definitely with regard to something like the EU Digital Services Act, but let's kind of bring it home and see what that would look like. So in India, we have this framework called the IT rules, which broadly regulate all your social media platforms. And what the IT rules does is if you are a social media platform with a larger user base, you are a significant social media intermediary. There is a threshold. But let's say I want to know if you're a significant social media intermediary or not. Right now, I look at the user base of a platform. So depending on how many users an Instagram has or a Twitter has, I classify them as a significant social media intermediary. If you are below the threshold, you are not. You are a normal social media intermediary. Now, when it comes to Mastodon, what do I count to know which category you fall under? Do I count the number of users in one instance, or do I count the number of users across all instances? And that's one problem. But even more broadly, how do I enforce? So you need a grievance officer, for example, under our IT rules. Now, should that grievance officer be at each instance level? Is there one grievance officer? And exactly who is this even going to be? If it's all volunteer led and it's not exactly like a company and its structure the way that we know most social media platforms work, who's going to take this mantle up? Who's going to hold them accountable? So these are larger questions that remain. And I think a lot of laws that tend to regulate social media obviously came in the wake of a certain vision of centralized control and centralized moderation. They've not accounted for this shift. And actually, in our own paper, which we published in 2024 on platform accountability and online harm diffusion, we argued that when you make larger platforms the locus of enforcement for online harms, you miss the diffusion that we've been talking about. And this is exactly an example of that, right? Which is you're seeing the diffusion of stuff from Grok to Reddit and then possibly onto a Mastodon. That's just how harm travels. It never stops with a few small, large entities, right? It just keeps propagating, keeps molding, keeps shifting, but your law is not yet caught up with that reality. So I think that remains an enforcement gap that exists as of right now.